Good evening and welcome everyone. I'm Kristen Regina, the Arcadia Director of the Library and Archives. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping notes. Your screen is not being shared and you are muted, but feel free to submit questions at any time in the Q&A. We'll answer as many questions as we can at the end of the conversation. You can turn on captioning by clicking the CC button on the Zoom dashboard. And our program is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you after the event. Next slide, please. We are delighted that you can join us this evening for the 17th Annual Arcadia Library Lecture, albeit our first virtual event. Sorry about that. Thank you for all your support of the museum through participation in programs like this. It means a great deal, especially during the museum's closure. I'd like to thank the Arcadia Foundation, who not only funds this annual program, but much more. I'd like to add a special thank you to Marilyn Steinbright, President Emerita of the Foundation, and Dr. Betty Landman, the current president and a member of our Library and Archives Committee. They are wonderful partners and supporters of the museum in general, and of our Library and Archives in particular. Many thanks as well go out to the Library and Archives Committee, and a special thanks to Martha Morris, the committee chair. I'm so grateful to her and the committee's always generous support. Lastly, I'd like to thank the Getty Research Institute for co-organizing with us this two-part series on the recent Getty publication, Hollywood Arensberg, Avant-Garde Collecting in Midcentury L.A. It's a meticulous and in-depth study recreating how Walter and Louise Arensberg purposely displayed, interacted, and truly lived with their collections in their Hollywood home. The book reunites the collection, which now lives on two coasts, and animates new meanings and contexts that have been lost over time. There are two links in the chat. One, if you'd like to register for the Getty subsequent program titled Hollywood Arensberg, Arriving at the House, and that will be on March 9th, 2021. And there's another link if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book from our museum shop. Next slide, please. We are joined by the book's authors, William H. Sherman, Director of the Warburg Institute in London, Ellen Hubler, the William B. Ziff Jr. Associate Curator of Art of the Americas at the Walters Art Museum in Baltimore, and Mark Nelson, an author, design director, and partner at the book design firm McCall Associates in New York. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by Matthew Affron, the Muriel and Philip Berman Curator of Modern Art here at the museum. The Arensberg Archive at the Philadelphia Museum of Art is an invaluable resource that contextualizes and helps us understand the Arensbergs' art collections, how they were built, their interactions with artists, and the history of the art in general. And you can also see a link to the archive's finding aid in the chat. The archives contains correspondence, ephemera, clippings, writings, art collection and personal records, and photographs created and collected by Walter and Louise, as well as some material created on the couple's behalf by their secretary and the staff of the Francis Bacon Foundation located in California. It includes correspondence with authors and artists such as Constantine Brancusi, Man Ray, Beatrice Wood, and most notably, Marcel Duchamp, who was instrumental in helping them build their art collection. This is supplemented by extensive correspondence with art dealers, museums, galleries, and publishers. From all of these documents emerges a vivid picture of how the Arensbergs built and maintained one of the most important collections of modern and pre-Columbian art in the 20th century. Thank you again for joining us tonight and for your support of the museum. And thank you so much to our speakers. Without further ado, I'd like to welcome them to share some of their exciting new discoveries. Matthew?
Thank you, Kristen. And I'd like to say hello to our participants and also to all of our attendees. And we're going to have a conversation about the book this afternoon. To set the stage, I'd like to use this photograph taken in the summer of 1936 and use it to introduce firstly Louise and Walter Arensberg. Bill, let me throw it to you. Again, to set the stage, tell us who were the Arensbergs?
The Arensbergs are the creators of this extraordinary art collection that you in Philadelphia have had the pleasure of looking after and showing to people like us for a long time now, since 1954. They were the great patrons and friends, and in some ways, co-conspirators with Marcel Duchamp, one of the 20th century's greatest artists. And you see here on the right, the sort of museum in a box that he made, the so-called boîte en valise, or box in a suitcase, where he brought together reproductions of all of his masterpieces, almost all of which were living in the house in Hollywood that the Arensbergs owned, cultivated, designed. And so really the story in some ways is, how did we get there? How did the Duchamp material get there? What did they do with it? And then how does all of that stuff end up in Philadelphia? So that's the story we're going to tell.
Back up 1 second, I should have pointed out that in this photograph taken by a friend of all those people, the artist Beatrice Wood, Los Angeles, you've got Walter Arensberg on the left and Louise Arensberg sitting on the right, and Marcel Duchamp with a pipe in his hand, as almost he always is, behind her. And you alluded to it, Bill, a minute ago, why Duchamp was so important and what he was doing in Los Angeles in 36. Let's underline a little bit of that before we move on, if you don't mind.
Indeed, sure thing. Yeah, I mean, remember, he was in New York with the Arensbergs, as we'll talk about in a minute, in the 1910s in the wake of the Armory show, and has come to California, where they've moved, because he hasn't seen his friends and patrons, or indeed the originals of his own artwork, for more than a decade. They moved to California, they take his artwork with them. He hasn't seen it. When he wants to do these color reproductions for the boîte en valise, he needs to see the artwork itself. And I think he's, as you'll see, quite shocked by what he sees, not only in terms of the couple and this amazing collection that has grown and grown since it left him and it left New York, but also in many ways with the way they're displaying his art, with the ensemble it's become part of, with the clusterings and the patterns that they've created, I think really took him by surprise.
Thanks, good. So moving ahead, Duchamp is there to visit his friends and also to reacquaint himself with some of his own works in their collection as he's preparing the work that we looked at a minute ago, the box and the valise, the kind of portable museum in miniature of his own production as an artist. But to move forward, before getting to the details, Mark, maybe we should start by saying something about the general experience, the general character of the Arensbergs House Museum, and maybe even say something about what made it so unique in Los Angeles at the time. I'll pass it to you.
Sure. Thank you, Matthew. Thank you for having us this evening. To the extent that the Arensberg photos are well known, this is probably the best known. It's a picture taken by the photographer Fred Dapprich in 1944. And it is probably the one that best shows at a glance the extraordinary situation that visitors found themselves in when they visited the home. If you back your gaze up a little bit, you can see, for example, that the picture is taken through an archway. There were in fact two archways in the home that separated the two principal living spaces, the living room and the dining room. And so this photograph is taken from the dining room into the living room, and we're looking at the foyer through the door. Now, one of the things that's so spectacular about it is not just the fact that there are all of these incredible masterpieces. The really incredible thing is how much the Arensbergs were in fact engaged in a very serious kind of play. So you can take a look, for example, at the very important early de Chirico painting here on the left. And you can notice that, for example, Ariadne, if you wouldn't mind with the pointer, Matthew, the Ariadne reclining here on her pedestal seems very much to almost be laying right on the couch below. This is an observation that was first made by an artist named Michael Minnelli. You can see that the arch in that painting mirrors not only the arch we're looking through, but also look through the door and you'll start to get a glimpse of the arch in the foyer. You can see that up above the door frame there is a painting called Landscape with Roofs by Jean Messenger. And it's a very obvious and purposeful pun that the picture is put up by the roof line of the house. And then you can finally see over on the far side, if you take a look over here, this very meticulous arrangement. You've got, for example, the apes in this fabulous painting by Henri Rousseau. And it's almost as if the Arensbergs have said to themselves, let's build out a kind of trompe l'oeil situation where these pre-Columbian sculptures that sit on the bureau are in fact joined with the painting behind it. The little pointy ears of the griffin-like fellow on the right on the bureau is in fact mimicking the little pointy ears on let's call them the apes. I'm not quite sure what kind of animal they really are. And the woman, the figure of a woman, has her arms crossed in exactly the same way that the apes in the picture do. And I know this is a little bit hard to see in this slide, but enough to say that these are very, very meticulously arranged scenarios. I just would point out in some closing comments here, I suppose, that there are two things that are not pictured here. One is color. And so it really takes a bit of imagination, but when you consider that there are at least 9 or 10 Persian rugs laying in a crisscross pattern, sometimes piled 2 or 3 deep, and that every one of these paintings and all of these, the bureau front and the couches were all in color also, it must have been just an extraordinary sight. And the second thing I would say that's missing here is people. And that's a thread that runs through all of these pictures. The Arensbergs did not want to be photographed with their collection. There are very few pictures, in fact, of people in the house. And yet, this living room was a profoundly dynamic space that was populated by some of the 20th century's most extraordinary thinkers and writers. But not only that, but the average kid from next door could come on by for a visit if they wanted to.
Thanks. Let me follow up still by way of introduction and move forward by picking up on something that Mark just said, which is that this is a house which is full of very fine-tuned relationships between different kinds of objects, works of art, two-dimensional objects, three-dimensional objects, furniture, rugs, and so forth. And that's really one of the things that the book, Hollywood Arensberg, focuses on. Let me say a few words about the book, whose publication we're celebrating this afternoon. Hollywood Arensberg, subtitled Avant-Garde Collecting in Midcentury L.A., offers a portrait of the extraordinary Arensberg collection of modern painting and sculpture, Renaissance literature, and pre-Columbian art in a particular setting, the setting of a house on Hillside Avenue, Los Angeles. The core of the book is a sequence of 59 photographs from the 40s and 50s. These photographs cover nearly every wall and corner of the residence and extend to its outside patio. The plate on the screen right now shows one of the walls in the so-called sunroom, which is a space that we'll return to later. And in this photograph, you can pick out some of the outstanding works in the collection. For example, Salvador Dali's Soft Construction with Boiled Beans from 1936, next to Marcel Duchamp's Nudes Descending a Staircase No. 2 from 1912. Each of these plates is interpreted with both a floor plan and a floor plan, as you see on the left in this double page spread, a floor plan with directional indications of point of view, and with the same photograph, a number diagram, which is keyed on the left to a list of captions, which allow you to identify all the objects visible in any particular shot. And that is how Hollywood Arensberg takes us on a room-by-room tour of the house and its contexts. And sometimes there are even wonderful close-ups to really get us into the setting. No less important, certainly, are the evocative and thought-provoking essays by our three authors, which illuminate the stories of the Arensbergs, their collection, and the house. Today's conversation is going to introduce us to some of those ideas, but for the full story, I urge everyone to get their hands on this beautiful book. Now, given that the setting of this afternoon's presentation is a library and archive setting, I'd like to point out, before we move more into the book, that there's a fascinating archival backstory to Hollywood Arensberg, in the sense that what we learn in the book could not really be conveyed without a lot of work in the archives which today are dispersed in different institutions in different places. For example, you have on the one hand a collection of more than 1,000 art objects from the Arensbergs, which were transferred to the Philadelphia Museum of Art in the early 50s, and also the archives relating to those art collections, which are here in Philadelphia. The photo on the left side of your screen shows the so-called Tribune Gallery at the PMA. Tribune, because of its basilican floor plan with a semi-domed apse. Nowadays, we usually call it the Brancusi Gallery, because it looks different today. In 1954, when the photograph on the left was taken, that space was set aside for the greatest hits of the Arensberg collection in its inaugural installation. But let me throw a question to Bill, moving to the image on the right side of the screen. No less important in terms of archival supports was the Arensberg collection of rare books and manuscripts. What was this part of the collection and what happened to it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we tend to talk about the Arensberg collection as the great collection of modern art, and in dialogue still in 1954 with the pre-Columbian pieces. But what it's super easy to forget is that there was a world-class rare book library. In fact, I'd say it's probably more accurate to talk about the Arensberg's collections, plural, and archives, plural. On the left, you can see all of the art. On the right, you actually see the reading room of the so-called Francis Bacon Foundation, which held the couple's rare book library, and in fact, much of their personal archive, as well as the working papers of Walter Arensberg, who is entirely obsessed with Sir Francis Bacon, the English Renaissance writer and statesman. There's a real sense of cognitive dissonance here for everyone. I mean, those who work on Duchamp, those who work on pre-Columbian, feel pretty comfortable on the left, but have no idea that the right side of the image is created by the same people as part of their overall project. Indeed, both collections, rare books and art, were created under the umbrella or the rubric of the Francis Bacon Foundation. What happened was, after the couple died, the foundation moved to the campus of Claremont College, and here you see it in a custom-built building on the campus of Claremont, just outside LA, with bits of the Arensbergs' furniture still there. So it's still like an extension of their Hollywood house. It was actually directed by Walter's chief assistant, Elizabeth Wrigley, for several decades. And when she died, the building was taken back by Claremont for other purposes. And that whole library and the archive that went with it went to the Huntington Library in Pasadena. And that's where it all lives now. And that's where I discovered it, or encountered it rather. It was already discovered in 2008. So this is 12 years ago. I kind of entered stage right, and Mark Nelson entered stage left with his interest in the very different collection that is much better known. Now, it does strike us as a little bit bizarre that the purposes under which this world-class library were collected were to prove that Francis Bacon had written the plays of Shakespeare. We have to get that out right now, right on the table. That will strike a lot of people as strange, and certainly incongruous with the canny and adventurous collecting that they're doing that's in evidence on the left. But there is no denying the quality of the library to the couple, and also of Francis Bacon, his importance to the English-speaking world in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For Walter, Bacon was the culture hero. and was very closely related in his achievements and in his methods to the kind of work that he was collecting with, above all, Duchamp, but also Klee, Picasso, etc. So we'll dig into that a little bit later, but it simply, for now, it suffices to say that given how different those two collections are and the fact that they now live on two sides of the country, it's maybe not surprising that they've been separated. But we have to remember that they were created by one couple as part of a single overarching project. And a big part of what we set out to do in the book, as I said now, over a decade ago, is to ask what we can learn if we put those different collections and supporting archives back into the walls of the house in Hollywood, where all of those objects and all of those ideas intermingled for almost 3 decades in the first half of the 20th century.
Great. And now, Ellen, I have a parallel question for you. The slide on the image on the left shows us how important pre-Columbian sculpture was as the future of the Arensbergs collection. And that takes us to another archive and another major player in the story, the dealer Earl Stendhal and his papers, which are now housed at the Getty. Why were those archives so important to what you accomplished in the book?
Yeah, I mean, I think many people have heard of the amazing Arensberg collection, but almost always in the context of their modern art collection. And in a way, perhaps their eye was so good for the modern works that that those have tended to overshadow the approximately 300 pre-Columbian works of art that they collected during their lives, but largely sort of from the late 30s until their deaths in 1953 and 54. And the great majority of those works were purchased through Earl Stendhal, who we see on the screen here and on the right. So it's kind of incongruous. We see on the left an early version of his art galleries in Los Angeles, and it looks very sort of tame. In fact, he did sell all kinds of art, not only pre-Columbian, but by the late 30s, as the Arensbergs' interest grows and they become these really ready market almost for him, so keen on increasing their purchases from Stendhal that they in fact trade him the deed for the property next door to them in exchange for a certain number of pre-Columbian works. So they are extraordinarily important really in each other's lives. And he was a very, very interesting character. And as part of the Getty's work for the pre-Hispanic art provenance initiative, they acquired the Stendhal archives, the Stendhal Gallery's archives just a few years ago, and are working on digitizing those. So we were very lucky to have early access to those archives in order to complete the essay on pre-Columbian art.
And last word on the archival support for the project, back to Mark. Finally, this book also entailed extraordinary work with photographers' archives. Can you say a few words about a couple of the photographers whose work so strongly informed what you were able to accomplish in the book?
Sure. One of the most poignant things about this book in some ways is that it is a book of photographs, but no one photographer actually took all of those photographs. They were in fact taken at different times, intervals, and it's crucial in some way because it helps to understand that, because it helps us understand how the collection was changing over time. As I mentioned in the first slide that I was talking about, they loved playing with their artworks. And so from picture to picture, from slide to slide, you see the artworks change position. The artworks get moved from room to room. And this isn't just the way we all do it, where we get tired of something, so we switch it up. This is really, how can we make the most playful arrangement possible? And I think we all felt that it was very crucial that the people who documented the Arensbergs be counted in that story. Starting on the left with Beatrice Wood, who we mentioned, took the cover photo showing Duchamp that we started the slideshow with, all the way down to Charles Sheeler, who was one of the only people allowed to, one of the only people rather, who photographed their home both in New York, where they started their collection, and in California, where they finished it.
Good. Now, speaking of Sheeler, he can get us into a bit more of the meat of the topic. If we move to this slide here, the story of the Arensbergs usually begins around 1914, when they threw themselves in the first place into the world of avant-garde art and literature in New York. This is a photograph taken by the prominent painter and photographer Charles Sheeler of one wall in the great room of their apartment on 67th Street in Manhattan. Just to get us going on the meat of the question, Bill, what attracted Walter and Louise Arensberg to the cultural conversation around modernism in the first place?
Well, they had come from Harvard, where they had a very rich cultural life, but a pretty traditional one. Walter became a poet, a published poet. He had several books published by this time, by 1914, and he had a pretty successful cultural career. But they got utterly swept up in the modernist movement that followed the introduction of art in the Armory show, the so-called Armory show in 1913. They decided very quickly to start to collect that art. They bought almost nothing at the beginning and ended up catching up very quickly. But they also, as you can see here, created that classic mix already of extremely contemporary European experimental art and some ancient figures from other cultures. So that's just a beginning. But they were absolutely key figures in that New York scene in the 1910s.
And again, we're in 1919 in this photograph. Mark, what about the social world that gathered in this room around the Arensbergs, let's say during the First World War?
Yeah, this is really probably a boilerplate image that stands in for everything that was new and exciting in these years. This image is produced fairly frequently in compendiums on Dada and early modernism. The scene was quite lively, you might say, filled with alcohol and great goings-on, parties that lasted all night long. There is no visual record of that anymore. There are some written records that lay down what happened. The scholar Francis Naumann has written fairly extensively on these years. We don't talk about them as much because the California years are a little bit more forgotten. But there are some extraordinary things to learn about this photo that are maybe not even quite so obvious, that might help bring back that time a little bit. For example, on the far left, you actually see something that maybe isn't looked at very much, and that's the piano. Louise Arensberg, in fact, had gone to finishing school in Dresden and was, according to another Arensberg scholar, Naomi Salson-Gorse, an exquisite bel canto soprano. And so, especially when she was in the company of friends, she would perform for them, and presumably she also tickled the keys a little bit at these parties from time to time. These parties were populated by an extraordinary cast of characters, everyone from Robert Allerton Parker, Louise Norton, Isadora Duncan, you name it. Probably if you were in the scene, you were at their apartment. I would point out before we move on, especially Duchamp's chocolate grinder painting up here in the top left. Duchamp had become fast friends with the Arensbergs. They in fact were renting another apartment in the same building for him, and they were exchanging that rent for ownership of what is one of his most famous pieces, which we'll talk about in a little bit, the Bride Stripped Bare by Her Bachelor's Even, which we call usually the large glass in shorthand. But this chocolate grinder painting up here was part of a sort of self-reflexive and personal set of narratives that that Duchamp at the time was exploring with himself. And in fact, that image, that sort of combination of mechanization and euphemistic sexuality was a part of the large glass. So we'll be seeing that again a little bit later in the presentation.
Ellen, to get us now finally from the East Coast to the West Coast, the Arensbergs made the shift to Los Angeles initially in 1921. Can you tell us some of the reasons why they left New York?
Sure, and just before I do, I just would love to just point out that this particular photo is so fabulous. I mean, any of our listeners who have been to the Philadelphia Museum, probably many of them recognize, even in this small image on the screen, that the Matisse painting Mademoiselle Yvonne Landsberg above the hearth, and that there's, you know, you could teach a whole course on modern art just looking at the works here from Braque, from Cézanne, from Duchamp. But there's also African works there on the mantelpiece, these Fang works from Gabon. And then in front of the hearth on the floor, but I would say also in sort of a position of pride of place, is a stone work that it's really hard to see, but that is an Aztec work from central Mexico, probably a figure of Quetzalcoatl, the feathered serpent. And so this is a real foreshadowing of what will happen in California with a real proliferation, particularly of pre-Columbian works. They are forced to leave, perhaps because of the person who sold them, in large part because of the person who sold them that Aztec piece and the African pieces as well. The Arensbergs were always creative, exuberant, but Walter Arensberg, particularly in these years, was a soft touch, really willing to loan money to people who had no way to really pay it back. And in this case, he really gets in over his head with their friend and dealer, Marius de Zayas, and end up owing him an enormous amount of money, over $100,000 in 1919 dollars, which would have been practically $1 million today, which sort of starts them on this series of vacations to recover dignity and to recover financial stability as well. And, you know, I would say, as much as during the pandemic, it's hard to imagine that they just got tired of living this wild bohemian life that both Bill and Mark have talked about, with literary, you know, avant-garde literary figures and artistic figures. But in fact, that is what seems to have happened, was they also were, I think, ready for finding a new way that was not quite so soaked in alcohol and nightly entertainments.
Thanks, Ellen. And thank you for pointing out those works of art in this photograph, because you're going to see them again right here, where we chose this photo, also by Charles Sheeler, but taken 20 years later in 1939, to catapult the discussion forward in time and space across the continent, and to finally get us into the house on Hillside Avenue in Los Angeles that the Arensbergs occupied in 1927. What's so nice here is that you see again the portrait of Yvonne Landsberg by Matisse, and the two Cézannes that had been over the mantelpiece in the previous slide, as well as one of the wooden African figures from Gabon. So an absolute parallel, but a new arrangement in a new setting, and then new things like the textiles and the Native American bowl, which is on the floor underneath the table here. This is good because it gets us to 7065 Hillside Avenue in Los Angeles. And now that we've gotten to Los Angeles, Mark, why don't you get us to the front door of the house?
Sure. So as you can see here, the house they decide to buy in 1927 is a fairly typical Mediterranean style building. It's got clay tiled roof. Its principal feature are the three massive French doors that line the east-west axis of the house and that are seen there framed by Eugenia trees. Just for a little bit of orientation, if you were to walk out those French doors and down those steps, maybe cut across the Great Lawn, all the way down the Great Lawn, you would find yourself maybe after 10 minutes walk down on Hollywood Boulevard, pretty much right in the heart or heading into the heart of Hollywood. If you were to head off say the top right corner of the picture, you would find yourselves a little higher up in the Hollywood Hills. You'd be at the Hollywood Bowl. Lloyd Wright designed Hollywood Bowl, I should say. And I mention that because Lloyd Wright, the son of Frank Lloyd Wright, was one of the Arensbergs' great friends. He actually would participate in their later salons, the literary salons they had more as middle-aged people here in California. And finally, if you were to head off the left side of the photograph, maybe 12 miles or so as the crow flies, you would find yourself in the Santa Monica Pier and the Pacific Ocean. So that's where you are. You'll notice before we leave the slide, there's a small, it looks like a building. It's actually the foyer that the Arensbergs had added onto the house in 1928. So if you could move along to the next slide, Matthew. And here's what it looks like to enter the house. So that you can see now that to this Mediterranean house, they've attached a kind of Palladio style symmetrical structure. And you get your first sense of the sightline through to the rear patio garden through the glass pane doors in the back. I'd like to point out before we move on, the arborvitae tree is on the left. They're important because they're actually masking a brick wall. And that brick wall was the property line at the time that the Arensbergs owned the house. And I'll show you why that matters here as we move on to the next slide. So what the Arensbergs did, why this somewhat traditional building is so incredibly radical, is that they had actually prepared their visitors for the shock they were about to encounter inside. They built this little structure specifically to hold these two artworks by Brancusi, Princess X, and that's the bronze sculpture in the little niche there, and the wood arch that surrounds it. Now, there are a few really interesting things to point out about this photograph. If you look, and why the design by Henry Palmer Sabin is so clever, if you look up at the top of the photo, you can see this gleaming California sunlight. And that was purposely built into this room so that the princess in her bronze would really, really shine. And secondly, the artwork called Arch is not a self-standing artwork. It actually needs to be supported to the wall. And so the pilasters that Sabin built into the wall, you can see them just barely at the top of this picture. You'll see them better in the next one. Were designed to purposefully align with the vertical posts of this artwork. And now obviously this artwork has a radical double image in it. You can see that, well, Brancusi famously claimed it was only a portrait of a woman, but of course everybody else saw a phallus. And so the Arensbergs right off the bat were challenging their visitors and their viewers. If you're gonna come in this house, you better be prepared. And I'll just say one more thing, in fact, that one of the few people we were lucky enough to talk to in person, we're a little late on this project, maybe by 5 or 10 years, but one of the few people we had been lucky enough to speak with was Elaine Lustig Cohen, an artist, a very fine artist in her own right, who was married to the very well-known graphic designer Alvin Lustig. And she told me that that when she came into the house, every time she saw the princess, she had to hold her breath. It just held her breathless.
Thanks. Ellen, this photo is 1928. If we stick for a moment into the foyer, but move to 20 years later, same space, 1948, the arrangement of the room obviously has changed substantially. What does the change tell us about, in a larger sense? What happened to the Arensbergs collecting activities in the LA years?
Yeah, we can really see here Earl Stendhal's influence. We can see that the Arensbergs are sort of letting loose. And I do think that what had been really shocking and avant-garde in the years that they lived in New York, all of this modern art, European modern art that was very shocking. We all know the story about Duchamp and his fountain, and how how aggressive this was, they begin to really get very, very excited about collecting pre-Columbian art while they're in California. And we can see how it's completely proliferated. So what we saw in the last slide, this very minimalist shrine to Brancusi, has been transformed into something which is now this garden of delights, garden of eccentricities. So I think they're actually sort of encroaching a little bit on Brancusi's princess, but you can see on the left, that is a goal ring for the sacred ball game of the Aztecs of ancient Mexico. You have different figures and fragments of stelae on the right. And then these two, what were known as palmas, again, part of the sacred ball game for the ancient Mexicans are now wedged right into that niche with the princess, sort of framing it on both sides. So there's this, it really clearly shows this real love of pre-Columbian rough stone that they had. We know that Earl Stendhal differentiated between Walter Arensberg, who he called the rough stone man, and one of his other clients, Robert Woods Bliss, who will found Dumbarton Oaks in Washington, D.C., and he was the smooth stone man. So, so we really see this love of rough stone and all of these contrasts and juxtapositions just between materials as well. As Mark had pointed out, you've got the some kind of an oriental rug there. Visitors to the house commented how these were often 2, 3, 4 deep on the floor. So you've got textiles, rough stone, and then that mirror-like surface of the princess in contrast to the brick and the wood as well. So it's a very rich space by this time.
Thanks.
Matthew, before we move on, could I just point out one thing I forgot to mention?
One thing
quickly, sorry. Simply that the arch itself that holds the princess was in fact repurposed. So you can see what Sabin did there is that he actually took the brick wall, that's what I meant to say, and that probably held at one time maybe garden statuary or maybe a planter or something. And he built this building for the princess, but using what was already there. I think a lot of people don't really realize that.
So are you saying it's an architectural ready-made?
An architectural ready-made.
Thank you very much. Let's move on. And we're going to start getting in a little bit deeper into the kind of interpretation of the collection. Bill, I've got a question. Drawing on a point the book makes, the case that you make in the book is that a specific set of intellectual concerns run through the Arensbergs' collecting activities, and that they can be understood really only if you see everything of what was going on in the house. Let's take the case of the Francis Bacon Library, which is obviously a portrait of great significance for Walter. We see him in the left of this slide, and a photograph taken in the first half of the 20s probably. What's going on? And what was he trying to accomplish, and did he have any help?
Yeah, good questions. Yeah, I think, it's a little bit weird to think about this incredibly successful and adventurous collector of art spending almost all day, almost every day, sitting at his desk with cigarette in hand, tapping away at an adding machine. This is not what you imagine the great collector of Marcel Duchamp doing. And yet, when I first opened the boxes that constitute the Francis Bacon Foundation's archive at the Huntington, I found this weird pile that you see on the right. And this is my own photograph, really fresh with discovery and puzzlement of what turned out to be tightly rolled adding machine tapes, all dated, all showing some particular calculation of a route through Shakespeare's texts to try to find the secret message encoded by Bacon to reveal the secret signature of Francis Bacon or the secondary meaning or some kind of decoding exercise. So Walter, above all, was into decoding. And I think that is really crucial. So here in this image on the left, they're not yet in the house that we reconstruct for most of the book. And most of what you see in the room is the rare books that become the largest private library of books about Francis Bacon in the world. This is an extraordinary rare book library that is already largely in place by the time they get going with their art collecting. But I think it's important, if you move to the next slide, I think it's important to put their art collecting in this context for two reasons. One, again, because the project that created this bizarre archive of contorted intellectual endeavor to make Shakespeare become Francis Bacon. And you can see in crude terms on the lower right corner on a decoding of Shakespeare's poem, Venus and Adonis, that you've got the answer. William Shakespeare is Bacon. It seems really strange that the archive that created this operation, with the help of a whole staff of 3 women full-time for their whole life, was also the umbrella organization owning and displaying some of the most adventurous art in the 20th century. But the reason why I think it's really important, aside from just filling out our portrait of Walter and Louise as people, is because I think you can start to understand the kinds of games that Mark was introducing us to earlier. They are all about pattern, and they're all about reconfiguration. They're about multiple meaning, puns, allusions, permutations, shifting personae where one person becomes someone else. Think Rose Salavi. You've got signatures that become something else. Now, actually, those, when I listed in that way, if I hadn't started with Shakespeare and Bacon, you'd think I was talking about Duchamp. There are many, many similarities in the operations or strategies that Duchamp is enacting in his art, in some cases in direct correlation or cooperation with Walter, that Walter is doing in this work, but for very different ends. And yet these are the two legacies. They're the divided legacies. You've got these absolute, beautiful mind scene books on the left, and you've got the extraordinary galleries of art that you are now the lucky curator of.
Well, I think this book really puts those legacies together in a totally new way, which is one of the great accomplishments. But to continue that theme, Ellen did this, if Walter Arensberg had a kind of symbolic mindset, which is expressed in his extensive work on Francis Bacon, if he thought that Baconian method was applicable to the appreciation of modern art in some way, was it also applicable to the appreciation of pre-Columbian art for him?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have to remember that this is the years that they're collecting are the years that are very, very important for the decipherment of Maya glyphs. And that's something that's to some degree sort of in the zeitgeist at that time. These are also years when you start to have facsimiles of different Mesoamerican or ancient Mexican codices or picture manuscripts being published and now being available to a broader audience than they had been before. And what we see here on the screen, twice in fact, is an Aztec calendar stone, sort of a smaller example of the Aztec calendar stone. That's probably the most famous work of art of all Mexico, which is sold on shot glasses and t-shirts and all kinds of things. This is an example. It was an example made, rather than in that rough stone, a more polished green stone. We see it on the left, and you've got your pointer right on it. We see it on the left in Earl Stendhal's gallery for sale, and then we see it on the right. This is covered with glyphic symbols. It's not exactly a written text, but it had a great deal of symbolic meaning that the Arensbergs, we know they were really interested in, because they speak with they write to different correspondents trying to know about this. This is a really interesting piece because it was probably the most expensive single work of art that they ever purchased in their entire collecting career. We know that they bought it for $20,000 in 1950, and that would be the equivalent of over $200,000 today. They arranged to pay in installments, and they buy it sort of so late in their collecting career that in fact, they've already arranged to give the rest of their collection to the Philadelphia Museum. So what is it? This is this thing that captures their imagination so much they decide they have to have it. But another really interesting thing about it is that it brings out the agency and the importance of Louise within this couple. We keep talking about them as a couple who were largely united in their tastes, and we do believe that that is the case, although the pictures are all of Walter doing his calculations. And we know that that's really his passion, but Louise is instrumental to the collection as well, in part at least because of her the funds that she applies to this. As I mentioned, Walter has foolishly lent out practically his entire trust fund before they leave New York. And so in their later years, they're really depending on her trust fund. And the invoice for this particular work of art is bought by Louise alone. And I've talked about this extensively with Mark. I know he thinks I'm a little bit overly, I'm maybe reading too much into her signature, but her signature seems almost defiant on that invoice to me, that she didn't offer to let Walter sign on with her. She just said, nope, Louise is buying the masterwork, which we will then pass along to the Philadelphia Museum of Art. So I could be wrong, but that's how I'm reading it.
Well, I think that's very important, because the next slide is intended to remind us that this was a house that was the project of two people who lived in it together, and it is not obvious exactly how to understand every aspect of the sort of partnership which they created as they lived there. Another thing that this slide does is it reminds us of something that I said earlier, which is that the book is remarkable for evoking the experience of walking through the house, although in the pages of a volume. And this slide shows the kind of sort of sight lines all the way from the foyer on the left to the so-called sunroom on the other side, which is on the right. What this is a question for really anyone, in a house that where the objects were so prevalent that they seem to submerge the experience of the house itself. What do we learn by looking at the ensembles and especially the sight lines in this way?
Well, I'll jump in here, Matthew, and I'll do so quickly because I can see the time is running away. You know, the sight line, when we talked about punning and gaming in the beginning slides, or even as Bill just did in the Bacon material, what we were most astounded by was how we saw that punning and gaming playing itself out over space and over different rooms. So for example, if you notice the Brancusi and the arch on the one side that we've just talked about, but we can see that arrangement is in a sense perfectly mirrored over on the other side, where we have also another Brancusi, his famous work called The Kiss, sitting directly on top of yet another Constantine Brancusi work, a wooden work called Bench. And so not only is there a symmetry in the house, but there's a symmetry in the rooms. If we switch back to the foyer again, we can see that that's a princess. But if we follow that line directly across, where do we end up? We end up at Marcel Duchamp's King and Queen. And so there are many different types of interplay, things that are probably talking to each other across rooms. Oh,
I would jump in.
One quick thing also is just to say that back to the agency of Louise, there is no way that two people could live in this home together and experience this extraordinary situation if they weren't in perfect agreement about what they were doing. Sorry, Bill, go ahead.
No, I simply wanted to make something that you were hinting at obvious and explicit, which is that they're playing chess with their artwork. I mean, Marcel Duchamp and of course, Walter are above all chess sparring partners. That's really what they bond over first and foremost. And what you've got here in these oppositional movements of kings, queens, etc., on a grid generally, sometimes very explicitly a chessboard, is literally or figuratively the moving of pieces in a game. And I think that you start to see that when you see this very, very clear, stark diagram showing the placement of princesses and kings and queens and emperors, etc.
We have just a couple of moves left to make. So let's go to the sunroom, which is the room on the lower right corner of the screen. I'm going to skip this slide actually to get us there. We have two slides, one in color, this one here. The sunroom was commissioned, a structure was commissioned by the Arensbergs and was the work of the modernist architect Richard Neutra. It was built as a gallery room at the rear of the house. It held 6 works by Marcel Duchamp. The book makes the case that the room was in effect a coded response to Duchamp and some of his main concerns. Very quickly, can we just fill that in a little bit here?
Mm-hmm. You want to move to the next slide maybe to do that?
Sure.
Right, so as Matthew said, there are many works by Duchamp in this room. And I mentioned earlier, back when we were looking at the New York slides, that the chocolate grinder was part of a self-reflexive, very personal language that Duchamp had created for himself. You can see it actually, the chocolate grinder is a part of the very famous work, The Large Glass, as is the watermill, which is just to the left. Well, if you look at the one that's in the glass, actually, just to the left. Yep, and you see that piece appears in the glider behind. And it's important to say that the Arensbergs had owned this piece and they were deeply grieving its loss. They had been forced to sell it to Catherine Dreyer. They were afraid it was going to break. And in fact, it did break. And so they were always agitated about the fact that they had lost it. And so what we think is going on here is that they, in fact, in the Neutra designed sunroom, kind of built a proxy for it. They hang the glider directly into the Neutra designed frame, window frame. You can see behind it the corn goddess almost starts to suggest by proxy the bride of the artwork's title. And if you look at it from the outside on the patio, you can see that they've also put the chocolate grinder, they've made a view so that you can see the chocolate grinder in relation to this construction as well. So we're effectively arguing that in so grieving their loss of the large glass, they've rebuilt it for themselves. And I think we should take 2 seconds to let Ellen really blow people's mind here too.
Sure. So of course, with Duchamp, the chocolate grinder or grinding, the bachelor grinding his chocolate is a reference to masturbation in some cases. But what's really neat here is that you have the bottom of a Costa Rican metate or actual grinder, which could have been used for grinding chocolate as well as whatever, corn or other things. So we see this particular broken metate right there that the red dot is on, where there's this actual chocolate grinder. So what I love is that they're bringing in the ancient American works as well as they're really finding a way to meld these two visual loves of theirs.
Great. Any last words on the sunroom before we move to our last big topic? No, we're good.
Yes.
Okay. As we mentioned at the top of the discussion, or as I mentioned at the top of the discussion, the Arensbergs finally gave their art collection, not all their collections, but their art collection, to the Philadelphia Museum of Art at the end of 1950. And over the next few years, those works gradually crossed the continent, crossed the country again, going from Hollywood to Philadelphia. Let's finish up by talking about what was at stake, or what were the implications in the transfer of the collection, or an important part of it, back from the house to the museum. And to open that discussion, we're showing I'll ask Bill the question,
Yeah.
identify what we're seeing, but ask him to what extent the ideals of the house might have been preserved in that.
I think, Matthew, the first question is how did it get to the PMA in the first place? How did it get to Philadelphia? Every museum in the country, many abroad, wanted this collection. I mean, who wouldn't want it? Incredible collection that people were wooing them for at least the last decade of their lives. So why did the Philadelphia Museum of Art end up with it? Well, there were two stumbling blocks to overcome. One of them was the diversity of the collection, in particular, the fact that there was a library alongside a great art collection. And very few people were willing to put those two things together into their institution. The second thing, though, in a way that's even more important, and for the Arensbergs was absolutely of the utmost importance, is that the place it went needed to retain something of the domestic quality of the display. So what you're seeing here on the left is the director of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, Fisk Kimball, in his total breakthrough moment when he's out on his campaign of acquiring this collection. And he's writing to the trustees saying, you know, I'm not going to come back until I get it. And, you know, he's writing this blow by blow account. And the breakthrough moment in many ways was this sketch that he draws, two-part sketch, to show what it will look like in Philadelphia. And the basic argument is, well, look, it won't look that different from your house. There'll be curtains, furniture, there'll be a real combination again of modern art and pre-Columbian pieces. And so they've really bought this vision of what he calls the dream house for the art in Philadelphia. And then if you turn the slide to the next page, then you'll see what actually gets built. Our next image, very different, much, much more familiar for those of us who spend a lot of time in museums in terms of its architecture, in terms of its mode of display. And I think what's interesting, of course, the Arensbergs never saw it there. They didn't live long enough to see it there. I think on the one hand, they would have been incredibly happy that their art had found such a good home back in their home, in Walter's home state. But also, I think in a way that could really showcase these individual masterpieces that they, in a way, had been so forward-looking in gathering together. And actually following the development on the case on the left of a Duchamp, on the case of the right of a Brancusi. But obviously what you're missing is a couple of things. One is the juxtapositions, even between Brancusi and Duchamp's lost now because they're in separate rooms. The pre-Columbian stuff is gone. The library never made it. No furniture, no curtains. You've really lost that domestic setting and the interplay of different things in a personal and meaningful pattern. And I think that's probably what they would have felt if they walked through this mixed feeling about what was gained and what was lost. I mean, you can see, especially with the case of the object that we've started with in many ways, which is the double of Brancusi's Arch and Princess, where it's a threshold. It's this active space through which you pass in a charged, spellbound kind of way. Within a house, a foyer. And here it's just kind of shoved along the side of one wall in a room that you walk through. And so I think you get a really clear sense of the change in that case.
I think we're hitting on actually what is a truism, which is that when you move works of art from a very charged context to another very charged context, things do change and meanings do change. And that's, I think, one of the fascinating stories that goes with this ultimate unveiling of the Arensberg collection.
Hey, Matthew, could you go back for just one more second? Because I feel like we missed one big beat.
Let me just finish my sentence and then we can go.
Yep.
So when you move from one highly charged context to another,
oh, sorry, Matthew.
Meanings do change.
Yep.
Meanings do change, and I'm going to cede the floor to Mark in a second, and then we're going to have one last shot at talking about, again, what those changes are. But please, Mark, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I got a little feedback there. I just wanted to add to what Bill was saying quickly that one of the most provocative questions I think we're actually putting forward, and hopefully maybe not answering completely, but starting to answer in this book, is really, how did Duchamp do it? I mean, how did an artist who had largely given up, supposedly given up art making, or told people he was giving up art making, and who had in fact largely foregone the selling of his works through the commercial gallery system for most of his lives, end up with his own room in one of the most important museums of art in the United States? I think the answer somehow resides a little bit, at least, in 7065 Hillside and his protectors there. And I think there's just a moment of reflection needed on that fact. Thank you.
And it, absolutely, because we know that Duchamp really encouraged the Arensbergs to select Philadelphia and help to oversee the transfer. And in his own canny way, was certainly aware of all of the issues we're talking about right now, about how a shift in space can, and the kind of space that a work resides can really change. It's meaning, I think maybe let's go back to the Tribune Gallery and give Ellen the last word. For you, Ellen, what are some of the implications of the move of the pre-Columbian things from the house to the museum in 1954?
Yeah, I mean, we've started with Beatrice Wood, and so we may almost finish with Beatrice Wood, because Beatrice Wood talks about having spent so much time at the Arensberg home in Hollywood, and how everything was, so accessible there and so drastically mixed. And she talks about things being kind of cold and dead in the museum. It didn't have the same kind of spirit to it. But I'm also struck by an early mentor of theirs, Walter Pock, one of the figures very involved with the Armory show, who talks about seeing some of their pre-Columbian works and says that there are some things that just got me by the throat. And I don't know whether it isn't more important for the public to see than the modern pictures that are cropping up on every hand now. Every socialite and her boyfriend are talking modern art, which doesn't spoil it for me, whereas the grandeur of those old Mexicans is still unappreciated by all but the fewest people. So I think what was really fabulous about this initial moment of installation was this fabulous juxtaposition of the pre-Columbian with the modern, and that it really did allow people to have a sense of, a limited sense, but a sense of how incredibly rich this collection was in context with this, with the contrast of ancient and modern color and stone and texture all together. So I think that's what it really evokes for me, this particular image.
Thank you very much. I think that's a good place to make a transition and move us to some questions from those who have followed this discussion. So I'm going to try to turn on my chat function so that I can see. Here we go. Now this is how it's going to work. I'm going to read aloud some questions that have come from the audience and give our speakers a chance to answer. So the first question is a Philadelphia themed one. Did the Arensbergs know Dr. Barnes? And is there any evidence that they were influenced by his interpretation of art placement?
Mark, you want to do that one?
I think that's
I have to say, I'm not 100% sure how they did know Dr. Barnes. I don't know what kind of personal contact they had. I do know that they greatly disliked each other for some reason, scathingly so. Arensberg wrote these amazingly descriptive letters of what he felt about Dr. Barnes. Now, the interesting thing about it is that it may be one of those cases of resembling yourself somehow maybe a little too closely. The odd thing is that while the Arensbergs were the kind of mainline type family that Dr. Barnes loathed, and in fact protected his own collection from in some ways by not allowing people to see it and so on and so forth, the Arensbergs had a strange populist streak. So they were often conspiratorially minded. They, were into weird origin stories. It isn't just a class story here. It's really something a little bit more complicated than that. But yes, I think they somehow must have known each other.
But the other thing I would point out by way of contrast, and it is something we tease out in the book as a contrast, is that Barnes is so pedagogically motivated. It's basically a teaching tool. And he's extremely verbose in explaining how he wants you as a visitor to understand the work in his collection. The Arensbergs are the opposite. They say nothing about why they're collecting what they're collecting, and they give you very little guidance. In fact, they give you a kind of what Walter Hopps, the great curator, as a teenager visited and said, it was like a Zen koan lesson. It was like a bucket of water being poured over me. And it was extremely mysterious and extremely puzzling. And so it was almost an opposing school of encounter with art and teasing out its meanings. So in that sense, they are truly opposite.
And yet I would point out also additionally that I think it was Jeremy Braddock that first pointed out that in Barnes's The Art of Painting in 1925, he may be the first one to in fact say that it is the spectator who creates the work of art. And that's a line that you hear frequently attributed to Duchamp or in Duchamp writings. And so the two men may have been much closer than they appear in some ways, may have been influenced at least on the underlying intellectual level by many of the same ideas.
I mean, they're both collecting the same kinds of art, which are not frequently collected in the early years, especially I would think the African sculpture. There's just not a lot of dealers. Marius Desaias and Stieglitz are some of the very few people who are selling and showing African art in New York at this time. So they may have met through that potentially.
Thanks. The next question is not a question, but a comment, which is just to remind us that the collection was installed by Duchamp. Duchamp certainly had a big role in it in 54, as you're seeing in this view of the Tribune Gallery, which is really a kind of church-like space. And we were talking about altar-like arrangements, and it strikes me earlier on in the foyer and in the sunroom of the house. It's interesting to think about this space with a central space and side chapels and a dome space at the end as another kind of, let's say, secular altar for art. Another question came in, which is, what is the state of the restoration of the Hillside residence today?
Yeah, I'll take that one. One of the great pleasures of this project has been, first of all, to know Ronald and April Dahman, the original owners of the house, who operated that space as a pre-Columbian art gallery right up till the time Ron retired in 2016. And of course, you might imagine that when they sold the house, we were a little terrified. We have floor plans, we have addresses, we have, in effect, their entire house inside this book. But the new owners turned out to be fabulous. Jonathan Browning and Marco Heithaus, who are doing a meticulous room by room, wall by wall, perfect architectural reconstruction, looking at the history. And one of the joys has been some of the things they've learned have influenced our book, and some of the things we've learned have actually changed how they're renovating the house. So it's been a great conversation. And unfortunately, because of COVID, the party for the book was in fact supposed to happen in the house, which would have been fabulous. Hopefully something can happen in the future, but for now they're moving along at a slightly slower pace for the obvious health reasons.
Next question is interesting because it gets us to current events. Someone mentions that the LA County Museum is proposing to do something in its new buildings which is to combine artworks of different periods and places in single galleries. The person who wrote this comment says that this presentation that we're seeing here from 50, 60 years ago makes me think that's not a bad idea. What do you think?
That one was really cutting out. Ellen, somebody?
Ellen's the one who works in a museum. I worked at the V&A for 4 or 5 years, which is about as chaotic a combination of things as you could hope for. Ellen, do you want to take a stab, and then I'll jump in if you want?
Well, I do really think that we are becoming much more aware, perhaps at times with non-European art, we are becoming much more aware of the ways that past and present intertwine and affect each other. So there certainly can be very effective displays. While museums have tended to have a gallery which is confined by space and time, there can be really interesting and effective ways. I mean, I think about all of the fabulous exhibitions that have come about where artists are allowed to choose works from across time and space, and how we sometimes come to new and exciting understandings of a work of art because it's been chosen by an artist on a theme. That's something that certainly for pre-Columbian, we're often driven to looking at themes because we may not have a completely encyclopedic collection that has all times and places. So I think there's definitely something to be said for it in under some circumstances.
Thanks. There's a question that I can answer quickly. Someone asks, where are the pre-Columbian pieces now? And these works are still in the PMA's permanent collection. They've been shown in various ways in the museum in the decades since this photograph was taken. They've also been widely shown in temporary and long-term displays in other museums. And we're always thinking about new ways in which we can do something like what you see in the slide right now, but differently, which is to think about how to bring these different parts of the collection together in ways for our audience in Philadelphia. Let me move on. There was a question for Bill, which I'd like to throw out. Someone says, we've learned now about the wide range of interests and collections pursued by the Arensbergs from pre-Columbian to modern to Sir Francis Bacon. They also display these items in ways intended to reveal and create new meanings and understandings. All this must remind Bill Sherman of Aby Warburg's life work. I'd like to hear Bill's view of the similarity and differences of these projects.
Yeah, thank you for that question. I'm now director of something called the Warburg Institute, which is in London, but it was created by the German art historian Aby Warburg. And it goes back to the previous question, which is in a way a challenge to traditional modes of linear art history and kind of isolationist museology, if you like. And I think Warburg's greatest, or at least most famous project is the one that he never finished, but worked on at the end of his life, called his Atlas of Images, the Bilder Atlas. And this Bilder Atlas is extremely interesting now to set alongside the Arensbergs, because it's basically, again, juxtaposition of rectangular image-bearing objects. I hadn't thought about Warburg very much when we started the project because I wasn't yet at the Warburg Institute. But in this year, it's been this extraordinary conjunction to finish the book and have it come out just as we reconstructed another reconstruction project, Aby Warburg's original working materials, all almost 1,000 images on 63 panels, and showed them in one museum space in Berlin. And for me, it was absolutely resonant to see how juxtaposition could work, but juxtaposition not as collage or as random or as arbitrary or as anything goes, but as argument, as discovery, as exploration. And I think these were scholarly tools for Warburg and for the Arensbergs as amateur scholars, but very much idea-driven people. They are interested in the ideas generated by these juxtapositions and not just visual patterns. So yes, thank you very much for that question.
Maybe I'll go back to an earlier slide, bring us back to the, let's say, we had a great one here, oops. Just to underline what you just said, Bill, someone else has asked, do you think the Arensbergs were applying some sort of principle of arrangement on arranging their collection? And I think that we've opened up this topic, but is there another way to get at this, looking back at the house?
Again, we provide in the book a couple of different models for approaching that come from their world. So one of them was chess. We talked about that already. Moving of objects in a rule-based way on a grid, in a bound rectangular space or square space. That's one method. Another one is poetry. You know, Walter is a poet. So it's not about saying directly what you mean. It's about setting in motion images that are not direct or not there on the surface. But I have no doubt that there are many other methods or modes of meaning making or of pattern generation to be discovered. And Mark, I think you and I have started to say, again, you know, when we started a decade ago looking at this, I think our eye was really naive in terms of looking very much at surface generation. But I think the more we look at the book and the more we talk to other people with different kinds of knowledge, above all, Ellen, our collaborator, but other people who have been dipping into the book in our company over the last year or two, really learning new ways to try to figure out what they may have been getting at. And I think what's exciting about this book, it's been an exhaustive process, but it's also in a way just the beginning, I think, now that it's out. And I think we're going to start to learn a lot more from people, including, you know, Matthew, people like you who are actually now living with this work. About how it means when it's set alongside each other.
Well, Bill, let me throw that to Mark also, because it brings us back to the book. Mark, what do you hope that people will take from this book that you designed, and what directions have you thought might be gone in now that we have this book to study?
And remember to unmute.
I think thanks, Matthew. Thanks, Bill. I think that there are many questions our book doesn't attempt to answer that it raises. For example, representation in the gallery and in collections. How do we come to have only 3 women artists in this book? And by the time the collection is disposed to the Philadelphia Museum, in fact, only 1. That's a crucial question. Where did the rest of the pieces go, like the rugs and textiles? Well, actually, I can see that Rebecca Johnson Melvin has asked about that. They went to the Huntington because they were actually previously lived on quite a bit longer. And so there they are. And my point being that any number of scholars, we've provided any number of scholars of any myriad interests to come on into this book, whether it be architecture, textiles, paintings, and we've provided, I hope, a roadmap so that scholars can look at this material in new and different ways. One of the astounding things about these archives is that the Arensbergs seem to have saved, literally, I'm joking a little bit, but seem to have saved every piece of paper that ever came into their house. So the archives are massive. I mean, Charles Eames, you could go so many different directions with this stuff. And try to parse some of the more interesting and important topical issues as well.
And maybe as a final word, a last question, and I'm going to pass the mic back to Kristen to close us out. But before then, Ellen, could you answer the same question? Through your experience of working on this project, where do you see the topic going forward?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Mark. There's so many more essays that could be written. I think we've all been in touch with Yael Biro of the Metropolitan Museum, who is interested in the African works, but a whole essay could have been written on the approximately I think it's 300 Native American works that they were collecting in the 40s as well. So there's so many different ways you could go with this. I think especially this was an exciting project to work on because there have been previous studies to some degree of pre-Columbian collecting in the United States in the mid-century, but not so many. So it's very exciting to be able to look at one major collection, how it was formed. We didn't get fully at why they chose these works, but how it was formed, how people approached them to sell works of art, how they chose some of these things. So for that reason, it's a very exciting project to work on.
Well, thank you, Ellen and Bill and Mark, and thank you to everyone who listened in on this conversation. I'm going to throw the floor back now to Kristen for some wrap-up remarks.
Yes, I would just like to echo the thanks. Thank you, Matthew, Mark, Ellen, Bill, especially Bill, staying up past midnight. Thank you for this fantastic program, and thank you to all the attendees for participating tonight and for supporting the museum. If your question wasn't answered, feel free to reach out and we will do our best to get you an answer. A reminder, the conversation is going to continue at the Getty on March 9, 2021, with their program, Hollywood Arensberg, arriving at the house. And again, if you'd like to purchase a copy of the book, there's a link in the chat to the museum shop where you can do so. If you enjoyed this program, please join or renew for member perks, such as member programs, free admission, and discounts. And if you wish to learn more, our member services staff are happy to help. We'll be sending out a survey immediately after this program and would appreciate a response by Saturday, December 19. The survey will also be included in the follow-up email, which will include the link to the recording of this program. Thank you again, everyone, and have a really great night. Good night.
Thank you.